Pennsylvania steel mills had taught Henry Kowalski one thing above all else. Precision mattered more than power. At 23, with hands calloused from years of metalwork and eyes that could measure an angle to the degree without instruments, he stood among 200 fresh recruits at Fort Benning, Georgia, watching a demonstration that made his blood boil. Sergeant Major Dutch Kellerman stood beside an M1 bazooka, barking instructions to a line of nervous privates who fumbled with the weapon like it was a rattlesnake. The demonstration target, a decommissioned Sherman tank hull, sat 500 yards downrange on the red Georgia clay. Fire in the hole! The rocket screamed from the tube, arcing high into the November sky before slamming into the dirt 20 yards short of the target. Dirt and smoke erupted uselessly. The next 3 attempts weren't much better. One sailed over the target completely. Another veered left into a drainage ditch. The 4th finally struck the Sherman's side armor at such a shallow angle it ricocheted off like a stone skipping on water. Kellerman's face turned the color of raw beef. That's 4 rockets wasted, gentlemen. You think the Nazis are gonna wait while you figure out basic geometry? Henry shifted his weight, jaw clenched. He'd spent 6 years in the Bethlehem steel fabrication shop, calculating trajectories for crane loads, measuring stress angles on support beams, visualizing 3-dimensional problems in his head while other men needed slide rules and drafting tables. What he was watching wasn't just incompetence. It was systematic failure. The bazooka sights were designed for direct fire at 200 yards. Anything beyond that, and crews were supposed to guess, compensate, pray. The Army's manual recommended aiming high for distant targets, but how high? Nobody knew. Nobody had calculated it. They were sending boys into combat with a weapon that worked on hope. That evening, in the barracks' dim light, Henry filled page after page of a notebook with calculations. He factored in the M6 rocket's weight, its propellant burn rate, the drag coefficient, the drop rate per 100 yards. He drew diagrams showing sight angles, ground angles, impact angles. He remembered something his foreman once said: "Every material has a shadow it casts under stress. Learn to read shadows, and you'll never make a bad weld." He started calling it the shadow angle method. If you imagined a shadow cast by the rocket's ideal trajectory, you could use that shadow as your aiming guide. The angle between your line of sight and that imaginary shadow told you exactly how much to compensate for drop in distance. It turned guesswork into mathematics. The next morning, Henry approached Kellerman during a smoke break. The sergeant major looked at him like he'd just volunteered for latrine duty. "What do you want, Kowalski?" "Permission to demonstrate an improved firing technique, Sergeant Major. I think I can hit that Sherman at 500 yards. First shot." Kellerman's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "You and every other hotshot who thinks he's smarter than the manual. You got 30 seconds to convince me not to have you scrubbing pots for wasting my time." Henry laid out his notebook, showing the calculations, the angles, the method. Kellerman's eyes narrowed as he scanned the pages. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Interest, maybe, or recognition that this wasn't the usual private's delusion of grandeur. "One shot, Kowalski. You miss, you're on permanent KP duty until we ship out. You hit, I'll listen to what else you got to say." 20 minutes later, Henry stood at the firing line with a loaded bazooka on his shoulder. 200 recruits watched from a safe distance. The Sherman hull sat in the distance, its rusted armor almost orange in the morning sun. Henry closed his eyes, visualizing the shadow angle. The sun was at 45 degrees to his right. The target was 530 yards away by his estimation. He needed to aim 3 feet above the target's center mass to compensate for drop. He opened his eyes, made his adjustment, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket left the tube with that familiar whoosh crack that made everyone flinch. It flew in a perfect arc, never wavering, and struck the Sherman dead center with a thunderous clang that echoed across the range. Metal peeled back like a sardine can. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before the recruits erupted in cheers. Kellerman walked over slowly, his face unreadable. He stared at the smoking target, then back at Henry. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only Henry could hear. "You just made yourself either very valuable or very dangerous, son. Maybe both. Report to my office at 1,400 hours." We need to talk about what happens next. Henry nodded, his heart still pounding. He didn't know it yet, but that single shot had just changed everything. At 1,400 hours sharp, Henry entered Kellerman's office to find he wasn't alone. Captain Theodore Ashford sat behind the desk, his uniform crisp enough to cut glass, his expression carved from ice. Kellerman stood by the window, arms crossed, looking like a man who'd just bet his pension on a bad hand. Captain Ashford didn't waste time on pleasantries. Private Kowalski, Sergeant Major Kellerman has shown me your little mathematics project. Interesting work. Unorthodox. Probably violates about 6 sections of the field manual. Henry stood at attention, eyes forward. Sir, the field manual doesn't account for... The captain's hand shot up, silencing him. I didn't ask for your analysis, Private. Here's your situation. In 3 weeks, we ship to England. In 4 months, we'll likely be in France, facing the best armor the Germans have. The Tiger, the Panther, the Panzer IV. Our Bazooka teams are currently achieving a 12% hit rate beyond 300 yards. 12%? Kowalski. That means 88 rockets out of every 100 are wasted shots while German tanks turn our boys into hamburger. The captain leaned forward, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Your method works. We saw that this morning. But do you understand what happens if I authorize training 200 men on a technique that's not in the manual? If it fails in combat, those deaths are on me. If it succeeds but contradicts established doctrine, I'm court-martialed for insubordination. Either way, my career is over. Sir, with respect, the current method is already failing. Captain Ashford slammed his palm on the desk. I know that, Private. You think I don't know that? I've read the casualty reports from North Africa. I've seen what happens when bazooka teams miss their shots. But the army doesn't run on what works. It runs on chain of command, established procedure, and covering your ass. Kellerman finally spoke, his voice gravelly. Captain, there's a middle path here. Ashford's jaw tightened. Which is, we don't teach it officially. Kowalski runs informal sessions after hours. Volunteer basis only. If anyone asks, it's recreational mathematics club or some such nonsense. The men who learn it, learn it. The ones who don't, stick with the manual. When we deploy, we'll have both options available. The captain stared at Kellerman like he'd suggested mutiny. You want me to authorize an underground training program that contradicts Army doctrine. I want you to give us a fighting chance, sir. That's all. The silence stretched for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Finally, Ashford stood, buttoning his jacket with mechanical precision. Fine. But understand this, both of you. This shadow angle method doesn't exist. It's not written down anywhere official. If this blows up, I've never heard of it, Kellerman never suggested it, and Kowalski is just some nobody private who thought he was smarter than the generals. Clear? Henry felt his stomach drop. Crystal clear, sir. Good. Dismissed. Outside, Kellerman lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. Welcome to the Army, kid. Where doing the right thing makes you a criminal. For 3 weeks, Henry ran his ghost operation. Every night after official training ended, between 20 and 40 volunteers gathered behind the motor pool, away from prying eyes. He taught them to see trajectories the way he did, to calculate drop rates in their heads, to read distance by landmarks and shadows. Some picked it up instantly. Others struggled but kept coming back, knowing their lives might depend on it. By the time they boarded the troop ship to England, 73 men had learned the shadow angle method. They didn't talk about it openly. They didn't write it in letters home. It became a secret language, shared through glances and subtle nods during official training exercises. Then came March of 1945. The 87th Infantry Division pushed into the Rhineland, and Henry's unit found itself in a small farming town called Korporich, just inside the German border. The town had been abandoned by civilians but not by the Wehrmacht. Intelligence reported light resistance. A few squads of infantry, maybe 1 or 2 armored vehicles. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. At 0600 hours, as morning fog still clung to the valley, the German counterattack came roaring out of the tree line. Not 2 vehicles. 2 Tiger tanks, massive and terrifying, flanked by 4 Panzer IVs spreading out information. Behind them, 2 companies of German infantry advanced with mechanical precision. The American line erupted in chaos. Rifle fire cracked uselessly against armor plate. A Sherman tank at the eastern edge of town fired, struck a Panzer IV, but the shot glanced off the sloped armor. The German column didn't even slow down. Henry's Bazooka team was positioned in a 3-story building overlooking the main road. His loader, a kid from Montana named Jimmy Reeves, was hyperventilating so hard he could barely hold the rocket steady. "They're too far," Jimmy gasped. "They're at least 600 yards. Henry watched the Tigers advance, their massive 88mm guns traversing, looking for targets. He thought about the manual, about Captain Ashford's warning, about everything that could go wrong. Then he thought about the 73 men he'd trained, scattered across the American line, watching to see what he would do. He grabbed the bazooka, loaded a rocket, and calculated the shadow angle in 3 seconds. "Load the next one the second this one leaves the tube. Don't stop. Don't think. Just keep loading." Henry aimed at the lead Tiger, compensating for the distance, the wind, the slight uphill grade. If you're watching this and wondering how this ends, stick with me. Subscribe if you want to see how one method nobody believed in changed everything. Because what happened in the next hour, nobody at Fort Benning could have predicted. The first rocket left the tube with a scream that cut through the morning air. The rocket struck the lead Tiger on its front glassy plate at a 40-degree angle, exactly where the armor was thinnest. The explosion blossomed orange and black against the gray morning. The Tiger lurched, smoke pouring from its engine compartment, and ground to a halt. "Load!" Henry screamed. Jimmy's hands moved on autopilot, sliding the second rocket into the tube. Henry was already calculating his next shot. A Panzer IV had broken formation, accelerating toward the American line. 540 yards. Moving target. Crosswind from the west. He fired. The rocket caught the Panzer on its side turret. The impact so violent it lifted the entire tank onto 2 treads before it crashed back down, burning. Across the American line, something extraordinary happened. The men Henry had trained saw what was possible. Corporal Davies, positioned 2 buildings over, fired at the second Tiger from 400 yards. Direct hit on the turret ring. The massive tank's gun froze mid-traverse. Private Martinez, in a foxhole at the eastern flank, took down a Panzer IV with a shot that shouldn't have been possible at that range. The German crew bailed out, uniforms smoking. The Germans had expected American bazooka teams to be ineffective beyond 200 yards. They'd planned their attack around that assumption. Now their armor was being systematically destroyed from distances they thought were safe. "Load!" Henry barked again. Third rocket. Fourth. Fifth. A Panzer IV tried to reverse into cover. Henry's rocket caught it in the exposed belly armor as it backed over a rise. The explosion sent the turret spinning through the air like a child's toy. The remaining Tiger, seeing half its force destroyed in minutes, made a fatal decision. It turned to retreat, exposing its thinner rear armor. 3 bazooka teams fired simultaneously. All 3 rockets found their mark. The Tiger exploded so violently that windows shattered in buildings 100 yards away. 62 minutes after the attack began, it was over. 6 German tanks destroyed. Not damaged. Not disabled. Destroyed. The infantry, seeing their armor support obliterated, surrendered or retreated into the forests. Henry lowered the bazooka, his ears ringing, his hands shaking from adrenaline. Jimmy sat against the wall, staring at nothing, trying to process what they'd just done. Captain Ashford arrived 30 minutes later, climbing the stairs to their position. His face was pale, his eyes moving between the burning tank wrecks visible through the shattered windows. He looked at Henry for a long moment, then at the empty rocket tubes scattered across the floor. "The after-action report is going to be very interesting to write, Private Kowalski. Very interesting indeed. Sir, I can explain." Ashford held up a hand. 6 tanks. 1 hour. Using a method that officially doesn't exist. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Henry met his gaze. "Kept my men alive, sir." The captain's expression shifted. something between respect and exhaustion crossing his features. The next morning, Henry was summoned to divisional headquarters. He expected a court-martial. Instead, he found a room full of colonels, majors, and a two-star general named Patterson who looked like he'd been chewing nails for breakfast. General Patterson gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Kowalski. You're not in trouble." "Not yet, anyway." Henry sat, ramrod straight, while Patterson paced the room like a caged animal. "I've been in this army for 26 years. Fought in the Great War. Trained thousands of men. And yesterday, a steel worker from Pennsylvania with a high school education made our entire ordnance department look like idiots." The general slapped a folder on the table. 6 confirmed tank kills in 62 minutes. 6. Do you know what the average success rate is for bazooka teams against armor? 12% at extended range. You and your men achieved 100%. 100%. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "So here's my problem, Private. I can't officially acknowledge a training method that wasn't authorized. But I also can't ignore results like this. Not when we're pushing toward Berlin and every tank we face is better armored than the last." One of the colonels spoke up. "We need this documented. Properly. Turned into official doctrine." Patterson nodded slowly. "Which is why, effective immediately, Private Kowalski is being promoted to sergeant and transferred to the Ordnance Training Command. You're going to teach this method to every bazooka team in the European theater. Not as some underground club. As official army doctrine." Henry felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "Sir, I'm not a trainer. You're the man who saved 200 lives yesterday by refusing to accept that good enough was good enough. That makes you exactly the trainer we need." The process took 6 weeks. Henry worked 16-hour days, translating what he'd learned into language the army could understand. Charts, tables, field manuals, training films. The shadow angle method became officially designated as Advanced Trajectory Compensation Technique, Bazooka Operations. By May, when Germany surrendered, over 4,000 American soldiers had been trained in the method. The reports that came back told stories Henry could barely believe. Tank kills at ranges previously thought impossible. Fewer casualties among infantry units. Entire German armored columns stopped cold by men who'd learned to see angles the way he did. Captain Ashford, now Major Ashford, found Henry the day the war ended. They stood outside the training facility, watching soldiers celebrate in the streets. "You know what the irony is, Kowalski? If you'd followed the rules, hundreds of men would be dead right now. Sometimes the system needs someone willing to break it." Henry thought about that Sherman tank back at Fort Benning, about Kellerman's cigarette-shaking hands, about Jimmy Reeves loading rockets with trembling fingers while tigers bore down on them. "I just wanted to hit the target, sir. That's all." Ashford smiled, something genuine and tired. "Sometimes that's everything." September 1952. 7 years after the war ended. Henry Kowalski stood in front of 200 cadets at the newly renamed Fort Moore, Georgia. The same red clay beneath his feet where he'd once fired that first impossible shot. But now he wore the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel, and the manual in his hand bore his name on the 3rd page as contributing author. The Sherman tank hull was still there, preserved now, its center mass puncture a permanent reminder. The cadets stared at it like it was a religious artifact. "Every one of you will learn the Advanced Trajectory Compensation Technique," Henry told them, his voice carrying across the range. "Not because it's in the manual, not because some general ordered it, but because somewhere, someday you're going to face a situation where following the old rules means watching your brothers die. And on that day you'll need to know there's another way." After the lecture, a young private approached him. "Sir, is it true you were almost court-martialed for developing the technique?" Henry smiled, the memory distant now but still sharp. "Almost. The army doesn't like people who think outside the manual. Until those people save enough lives that the army has no choice but to change the manual." That evening, Henry drove to a small house in Columbus, where Jimmy Reeves lived with his wife and 3 kids. They had dinner together once a month, a tradition that started the day they both came home. Jimmy worked at the post office now, his hands steady again, the trembling finally gone. Over coffee, Jimmy asked the question he always asked. You ever regret it? Sticking your neck out like that? Henry thought about the 73 men who'd learned his method. 58 of them made it home. He thought about the thousands more who'd learned it later, the ones he'd never meet but who were alive because someone had decided precision mattered more than protocol. Every single day, Henry said, and I'd do it again every single day. They sat in comfortable silence, two men who'd seen what happened when you refused to accept that good enough was good enough. If you made it this far, thank you for hearing Henry's story. It's a reminder that sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with weapons but with the courage to challenge a broken system. Hit that like button if this story moved you. Subscribe to see more untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment telling me what historical figure or event you want to hear about next. These stories matter. Not because they're about war, but because they're about ordinary people who refused to be ordinary when it counted most. Until next time, remember, the rules exist for a reason, but sometimes the best thing you can do is prove they need to be rewritten.